Hi, you're listening to Crime Tapes. The podcast is created in association with Staffordshire University and hosted by the School of Law, Policing and Forensics, and revolves around the themes of crime, criminology and sociology overall. Each episode we're going to have an expert from one area of the university to discuss crimes in relation to their subject area. And this episode we're going to be discussing films and crime. The current obsession with crime films and documentaries and the relationship that we have with these, why viewers are attracted to them, why they're of interest, and why it is that so much of the sort of media content that we see today on Netflix, on YouTube, on terrestrial television, on Sky, revolves around crime and criminality. In particular today, we're going to be joined by Stephen Griffiths, who's course leader for the BA Honours Film, Television and Radio course at Staffordshire University.
Hello, nice to see you.
And also with me is Kyla.
Hello.
And that's as much as Kyla's going to say this morning. Well, so far, as you know, if you've listened to this podcast regularly, Kyla will have more to say. Today we're going to be discussing representations of crime and particularly crime films. Now, everywhere we turn at the moment, we're sort of bombarded by crime films, and that's not something that's necessarily new. When I talk to my students about representations of crime in the media, and particularly in criminology, they very often start thinking that the important aspect of the media is factual, that it's about newspaper, newsprint representations, that it's about news media, it's about crimes that you see reported on the television and real crimes, and that, in effect, that's where criminology should focus. But there's been a growth in recognition that actually it's also factual alongside fictional representations that shape our understanding. And indeed, the line between those two is also often blurred. The way in which we see documentary now as entertainment means that docudrama becomes more and more focused in and at crime. So recently we've seen sort of debates about the Zac Efron representation of the serial killer Ted Bundy. Those are the sorts of things that we're going to be talking about today. But before we get into that, thinking about crime films and just where they are and how we like them, Stephen, what is your favourite crime film?
Well, it's very difficult to say, really, in many ways. And, having kind of top tens and best films and so on, I suppose for me, it would have to be the more nostalgic Agatha Christie kind of body in the library murders and so on. I used to be a great fan of a series called Cluedo, which was based on the board game and so forth. And a lot of those ideas that are built in that we can still see today in a number of TV series like Midsomer Murders and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kyla, would you want to live in Midsomer?
Definitely not. I would get out.
No, I think so. The murder rate in Midsomer would be through the roof. But again, it's interesting because such representations do perhaps also sort of shape our understandings of reality. If you think about it, people tend to think of the murderer as being a scheming and calculating individual, hidden motive that's never overt. They don't tend to think about the husband doing it with a knife in the kitchen, and so absolutely shapes our understanding still.
One good thing, though, about the likes of Midsomer Murders, for once it's the middle-class people not killing each other off, rather than the scallywag from down the street.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And
the stereotypes.
Absolutely. And there are plenty of dramas and documentaries that play to and perhaps sensationalise that sort of crime. So, Kyla, favourite crime film?
4 Weddings and a Funeral.
4 Weddings and a Funeral. Not a film that most people would think of as.
Have you actually seen that film?
Okay.
Criminal.
I'm starting to perhaps understand more so where you're coming from. 4 Weddings and a Funeral is an unconventional choice, but that doesn't surprise me.
Quite like 7. That was good.
7,
yes.
Absolutely. And of course, with 7, we get the introduction of a very, very early Kevin Spacey. I mean, crime and film tied together. We'll go no further with that one.
Let's leave it there.
Okay. Well, before we leave it there, I'll do my favourite crime film. My favourite crime film, Kyla, if you haven't seen it, is Face from 1997. Does anyone Face from 1997? No one would remember it, I am sure, but it features Robert Carlyle, and perhaps best described as a sort of socialist crime film in that the protagonists, which includes Phil Davis, Ray Winstone, Damon Albarn. Think about that for a cast. They essentially are bank robbers who are robbing banks because they have been made redundant by the capitalist system that is sweeping through the United Kingdom and resulting in post-industrialism, and so turned to bank robbery. So Face from 1997, although it only has a Rotten Tomatoes rating of 38%, which I can't believe. Face, one of the most overlooked of British crime films. It also has a fantastic soundtrack that if people like the Long Pigs.
I didn't have a TV in the 90s.
No,
I was going through that phase.
And if we think about mediated crime representation, I suppose that is one thing we ought to talk to Stephen about. In some ways, the growth of crime media now is perhaps to do massive. In part with the changing way in which we engage with media. Kyla says in the 1990s, where we were both around, largely sort of 4 television channels, terrestrial television channels. Some people had satellite, but the amount of material that we were engaging, we weren't engaging with downloading services like Netflix and so on. Some of this is perhaps simply to respond to demand?
Absolutely. I mean, crime sells, and that's the key thing. All media organisations have to produce products that are going to be attractive to audiences, and a quick and straightforward, or relatively straightforward way of doing that is through crime content. And there are all kinds of reasons why people engage and watch those kinds of programmes and kinds of films and so on. But they are, generally speaking, bankable because we can all associate, and we all have, hopefully not too many direct associations with crime, but we are bombarded with it all the time through the news media, and in many ways it allows us in some ways to safely explore some of these horrible, awful situations in a distanced way. And I think that's possibly why we have this attachment to these kinds of films and programmes.
So it's both sort of shocking and yet distant, and that's how most people... Yeah. And going back to what we were saying then, you know, the sort of experiences of crime might be quite limited away from engaging with the media. So the media is incredibly significant, whether it is factual or fictional, in shaping people's understandings, perceptions.
Well, sometimes there is that blur between the two. I mean, I think this is the interesting thing, and obviously people do become relatively desensitized by the fact that it is presented in a dramatized, entertaining, exciting way. And that can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing in many ways, that kind of blurring between the two. But people are excited by crime dramas. They like to see the resolution. They like to see the conclusion, if you like. They like to see the police represented in a particular way. They like to see the criminals represented in a particular way, and also to play around with the different narratives, maybe a little bit of the kind of, you know, who did what, that sort of thing, you know, following along and so forth. So it can be quite interactive in many ways.
And perhaps also if they don't necessarily then get those resolutions, which sometimes crime does not give us, that's also where you get the sort of enduring controversies. So if we think about some of the cases that have become particularly sort of significant and big at the moment, perhaps that lack of resolution is why people don't like Face as well. Not going back to the same thing over and over again, but the car, the ending, brilliant. But when we think, for example, about the way in which criminal justice is presented, particularly with factual accounts when it's crime news stories, it tends to be at the conclusion, at the summary, once a trial is concluded, or the reporting ongoing of the process. And then if the process doesn't sort of continue to play out, the news agenda moves on, and so it will be sort of periodically revisited. But that isn't necessarily the case when it comes to, for example, more mainstream media engagement with it. So thinking particularly about the rise of some of the newer services, we've got sources like Netflix, for example. And Netflix has recently been debated a lot for a number of sort of true crime documentaries. I think Making a Murderer and Netflix very much in some ways go hand in hand in promoting the platform. And for those that haven't seen it, Making a Murderer is the investigation of the criminal case against two men, Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. And it essentially sort of tells the story, but there are hints throughout of malpractice towards Avery, who has previously been incarcerated, and even more so perhaps against Dassey. But Making a Murderer came along at a particular time and sort of launched Netflix as a platform. Subsequently, there are other ways in which Netflix are using true crime. So one a particular interest, perhaps, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann and the documentary. That's been really, really successful, very high budget. Why, Stephen, do you think it is that in particular has that case, that story has such an appeal for people?
I think it's because there are so many different stories around the case, and I think it has maintained interest for an awful long time. In a way, it has everything within it. It has, the disappearance of a child. It has lots of kind of unresolved issues and so forth. But going back, one of the reasons why we like dramas that are resolved is because in many ways we have so many real crime cases that are unresolved. So by helping us and helping the audience to feel safe about things, we can then tap into these dramas and films that do resolve. But going back to the Madeleine McCann case, in many ways, it is a story that has so many different twists and turns. There is so much speculation about what happened and so on. It has drama, and it has drama that keeps people interested. But what's also an interesting point is that in order to understand and to appreciate the Madeleine McCann Netflix documentary, you have to have some knowledge of the case already, and that often is the case. People will access that series having heard previous media discussing the issue and the topic.
Yeah, so we don't necessarily come to it as a blank canvas. And
Certainly
I suppose
not.
the way in which people engage is different now as
Yes.
well. So it's not simply, and I do this, I don't know if you do this, Carla, but now I tend to find that you watch media much more so perhaps with phone in hand, tweeting about it, watching other people play out on social media.
Swearing is usually
Swearing, getting into controversial bust-ups with other people in terms of what you
Absolutely.
think.
But the whole Madeleine McCann thing, everybody has something to say on that issue. Whether that's talking to people, the water cooler moments in offices, or whether that's something on social media and so on. But the interesting thing about the Madeleine McCann documentary is in many ways it was this blurring between documentary talking heads and dramatised reconstructions, as well as carefully edited actual archive footage.
Yeah,
bringing it together.
Because I understand it cost about £1 million an episode, a massive budget. And as you say, some of that is the sort of docudrama. So they've gone back out and essentially filmed reconstructions of what is said to have happened or what occurred.
That's always the problem with drama documentary is did this actually happen? Okay, and all media is a representation of some description. But in many ways, to what extent have the producers enhanced certain sequences in order to keep audiences watching, and also to maintain watching and to maintain interest as well? And that's something that the producers have to include. And obviously that does raise questions about the authenticity and the realism of what's presented.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I guess what we're moving towards is there's always a sort of political platform, and such things sort of engage and create political debates. So sort of turning to Carla, I'm thinking about Netflix at the moment. We've similarly very political dimension to some of what comes out through Netflix. So the documentary, 5 parts, I've just watched it, based on the Central Park Wilding case, which is When They See Us, very, very powerful Netflix documentary that is essentially about the framing of a group of innocent young black men in the United States of America for a rape in Central Park. On that particular night, there were several instances of violence played out in Central Park. A jogger was raped. When They See Us essentially dramatises the experience of those young men. Now, there's also a follow-up, I believe, where Oprah Winfrey's talking to people involved. I haven't seen that yet. But that has brought the case back into the press, hasn't it? Particularly because there's a link to contemporary politics there. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Donald Trump pushed for the death sentence for these boys. He was instrumental in this. And I just think there's a massive sense of irony here, how Trump is himself. It feeds back into the whole fascist Trump. So, it's looking at the motives of Trump, really, and then relating them back to now. I think that's something that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and When They See Us is, although not about Trump, makes it quite clear that, in effect, as a political campaigner, he was saying, bring back the death penalty, very much associating with the right-wing sort of victims' rights movements in the States, and using that at the time as a platform. And, of course, the great irony was that the real criminals in this case were the police officers who were essentially breaking all sorts of rules in order to interrogate the suspect without representation, essentially to sort of concoct the story that they were responsible. And it was only subsequently that one of those convicted met the real offender in a carceral setting that led to them coming out again in a country where we know sentences for serious and violent crime are incredibly extensive. So there can be a sort of political dimension to documentary and drama, but there can also be a kind of controversial element as well, can't there, Stephen? Insofar as even in sort of framing the Trump narrative, we're hearing one particular side that people want to sort of portray.
I think it's very interesting when we're seeing the flaws of the police, because in many ways audiences like to see that. In some ways it humanises the police, but it also is a case of looking back at historic cases and learning from the mistakes of history in many ways. So we like to look back at those cases. But I think the flaws of the police is a very interesting one, and that's been something going way back in terms of TV. I mean, if we think about things like the Sweeney, for example, I mean, it was very much, these were bad men, and even if they didn't do the crime, they did something else, so we're going to get them.
Bad men doing good things.
Yes,
good things
absolutely.
for us as well,
but,
perhaps.
But in some ways, that links back to kind of the way that historic crimes are represented. If we think about how the Krays are depicted as heroes,
good guys,
and the great train robbers, and so on. It's very.
They loved their community. They did good for us. Ronnie had looked you in the face as he stabbed you in the eye.
And very good to his mother as well.
Good to his mum, absolutely. And again, like I said, the media play a massive part in framing that.
Oh, totally.
Interestingly, on the theme of the police and representation of the police in policing, one of the ones that I always think is useful when it comes to policing students is to sort of contrast and to do the compare and contrast between, in the BBC television programme Life on Mars, between the modern police officer that was Sam and the 1960s, 1970s police officer character of Gene Hunt, who was very much the sort of unrepentant, misogynistic, sexist, violent, unreconstructed male. But of course, one of the great ironies of Life on Mars is when that series was being broadcast in the noughties, that people actually said, we like Gene Hunt. There was almost a sort of
absolutely.
There was almost a sort of longing for that. What we want is that unpolitically correct police officer to come back and take a tough line.
Well,
he's a good guy, Gene.
Absolutely, and it was very much linked to the past. And because the drama was shot in such a way that was very much reminiscent of the Sweeney, it added into that fact as well. But I mean, Life on Mars is very interesting because effectively it's an historic drama. It's also a science fiction piece, and yet it's commenting on the reality of the 1970s police force, which we've seen in loads of documentaries, haven't we, about what went on and so forth.
Absolutely, and it's a lot more in many ways it's a lot more complex than to sort of celebrate Gene as a good character, because if we look at the legacy, it's exactly the same sort of style of policing that gives us when they see us, it round up the usual suspects.
We have this thing where we do romanticise the past.
Yes, totally.
And especially in the political climate that we have now, where we're constantly being told that we have got this woolly liberal attitude, and we've got all this crime, and it's because police aren't doing the job, rather than looking at the actual causes like austerity.
Well, yes.
It's like let's just say it's because we don't have police officers that break the rules to get the bad guy anymore. So then we are
do have police officers.
Yes, we do. Of course we do.
But I think the past is almost resolving those things that we can't resolve today in many ways. I mean, people look back at the past for comfort and celebration. However, when we look back at those periods, we can see that there were real times of unrest. The 1960s and the 1970s were not glorious decades by any means. However, one thing that is interesting is that our memories and our associations of the past are very much built on the repeats, the archive footage, the news material of that day.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't separate the two. We don't see the difference between the fiction and the non-fiction.
And
because
this is whether it's really interesting in that agenda, particularly as we describe things like fake news. What is true
totally.
news, and particularly with documentary, there's very much that blurring of the boundaries at times. So if we think specifically about sort of the representation of crime, and particularly sort of crime documentary, as you mentioned, the Madeleine McCann case blends the fictional and the factual. So we know some facts, but even which facts are facts.
It is. I mean, in many ways, the dramatised sequences are presenting to us footage that doesn't exist. You can recreate that footage with people on telephones or talking heads and so on, but that's not interesting for us as an audience. We have to see it on screen. The worrying thing is that becomes almost kind of marked in the minds of the viewers as the actual evidence of what we're seeing. And there are so many criminal cases and so on that we as an audience feel we have an understanding of. We don't have an actual understanding of the events. What we have is an understanding of the representation of that event through dramatised reconstruction.
Yeah, absolutely. So the dramatic representation becomes more real
than
the real facts of the
event.
And
who knows, in terms of the history going forward, is that we will, dramatised sequences will almost be presented as the fact.
But even in newspapers and the news, there's still that sort of dramatisation of the fact. It's not just happening in the world of film and media, it's happening in that sort of media as well, because at the end of the day, if I was to write a newspaper article on a killer or a crime, and if the crime happened at this time. This is what happened. This is a complete fact. Nobody wants to read that. They want to read the sensational aspects of that crime, and they will embellish those points. So people will go, oh, I'm going to pick this up and I'm going to pay for it and read it. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, this is not just public service when it comes to newspapers and the news. It's not a public service. Like, people think this is just a public service. It's still to make money within the capitalist system.
But also it's the challenge of the different platforms that exist. If you think you've got so many different areas competing against one another, just within newspapers alone, how do they stand out from each other? How do you capture that attention of the viewer?
If you look at newspapers, each newspaper will target their newspaper to a different section of society. So in The Guardian, they would look at sort of the identity politics surrounding this, looking at, sort of the government failings surrounding this more than some would say The Sun. The Sun would look at it like in a more very traditional, he was terrible, she was this, and let's all
individualised.
Totally individualised.
But obviously that brings with it bias to every single story.
Yeah,
if you are creating a story that's very much geared towards a particular kind of audience, that in many ways is creating an impact or a potential impact, and that may be leaving out certain elements of the story, possibly.
So, Stephen, thinking about how criminology might engage with sort of docudrama, as it were, that representation of reality. I watch a lot of programmes on crime generally. I see quite a few. And you do see criminologists, for example, come and give commentary on, serial killers, people who murder, people who are involved in crime and criminality. Do you think there are sort of ethical dimensions to that, both for those individuals commenting but also for the makers about what the motive is?
I mean, very much so. In many ways, the makers of these programs do have certain responsibilities, but then again, they are often geared around which kind of audience they're aiming at, which kind of broadcaster are going to be showing the final program and so on. Contributors, people taking part in the programme, they are interviewed. There is often a set agenda. Those people who are interviewed have no kind of control or say in how they're going to be represented in the programme later on, how it is cut together and so on. So there are ethical issues on both sides in terms of the expert, what is the expert representing, but also the other side in terms of how the producers are shaping, how are they questioning, how are they putting together those elements. often when people are interviewed, they are interviewed within the basis of other footage that has already been shot. There could be archive material as well that's going to be intercut and so on, which contributors don't necessarily know about.
But I suppose thinking about it, it's things like when you get, world's most evil, it's almost a sort of like there's a ranking system, but there's also a responsibility there, is there not, to not forget that, for each of those people doing the crime, there are probably a string of victims, and victims who, are not left around to express their objection. So,
absolutely. I mean, this is the great challenge, I think, with these kinds of programmes. On the one hand, we are very much desensitised as an audience, and there is confusion within the minds of the audience in terms of what is fiction and what is fact in many ways. And I think sometimes, because we have so many kinds of programmes like this, often we forget the people who are linked to this piece. And I often do think about that. I often think about, well, if you were affected by this, if your family member was murdered and it's then sensationalised in a documentary programme, how you would feel about it. And obviously having an insight, obviously having a kind of involvement in that particular crime. And I can imagine it being quite an unusual experience.
Yeah.
It can also be an unusual experience as well. Can you imagine sitting at home watching a drama with an actor playing you in a programme that's getting however many million viewers, which then cuts into an advert for the latest sofas or washing powder?
Yeah,
I mean,
although we talk about that, and that can seem quite abstract in some ways, we've seen debates in the real world play out in just that way recently. I was thinking in particular, we have Martin Clunes on ITV portraying the senior investigating officer in the case of Levi Belfield, and one of the things that was particularly interesting in that, I thought, is that members of the family came out to sort of say, at least the family of one of the victims came out to say, what you ought to do, at least in part, is remember that when you reopen those cases, you reopen for us the trauma of a horrendous crime that took our daughter, sister's life away, and you're doing that for not necessarily then to inform the masses, but rather to entertain them.
I think we're not just seeing the commodification of the killer, but the victim as well. And certain victims have got a certain typology that become more interesting to watch. So, for example, we can use the victim to us as in the same manner as the actual killer.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's a very, very interesting area. I mean, and we also have those dramas where the families are very happy to be involved, and the actors actually go and meet them, and they create,
as in the Sophie Lancaster case,
their performances around meeting the victims. But I think the key thing about all these kinds of dramas, and the big question is, what extra value is it adding? How is this allowing us to understand and interpret these crimes in a different way? And I think that's a really important factor, and that's how drama can explore that, and actors can explore the emotions that perhaps a talking head and interview would not necessarily introduce to the debate.
That's a really good point.
Almost
actually.
Humanise
the human side.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Which is so important.
And if we think about the Sophie Lancaster story, I mean, for those that don't know, I mean, Sophie and her boyfriend were out and about in a play park, a sort of kids' playground, where they came across a group of lads and girls, I believe, sort of drinking. Sophie and her boyfriend were emos or moshers or goths.
Emo, weirdo, freak is the actual terminology that they actually use.
The people that they encountered, the group of young people that they encountered, were not. They were sort of more streetwise young people. And ultimately, what happened is both Sophie and her partner ended up getting very sort of savagely beaten by a group of the young men. Unfortunately, Sophie died soon afterwards, but Sophie's mother set up the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, and when the BBC made a sort of docudrama on that, it was very much endorsed by Sophie's mother and the foundation as part of a means of sort of teaching people about the harms of hate and the harms of hate crime targeted against minority groups.
And from that, I mean, there has been sort of pushes to add hate crimes to people who would live some different
alternative
lifestyles,
and so on. The work of people like John Garland.
This will be for another episode of this, but there is a massive link to the case with Marilyn Manson and how what happened in Columbine and the demonisation of goths. and how it became sort of fair play to be able to say, oh, there used to be thing. I saw something once that somebody sent to me, which was Kick a Goth, and it was on YouTube. Or Punch a Goth, and it was. So this was just before this happened.
So the media can serve quite a progressive agenda in some ways, and certainly the sort of dramatisation by the BBC of docudrama based on that, and I can think of others as well, where particularly I think new forums like BBC Three have been quite socially responsible in some ways in dramatising some quite horrendous crimes, but things like Murdered by My Lover, which essentially tell stories of things like young people's experiences of coercive control and domestic violence, can actually be used to sort of challenge misperceptions and misunderstandings. But as you say, rightly, there's also the other side of it, which is that if crime sort of appeals to a general public audience, just generally, all sorts of things come into the mix. So discerning what's good is problematic. With that in mind, something that you were sort of saying was about audience engagement with it. Do you think that with more and more content coming forward, there is almost a greater demand for more and more sensational docudrama and footage that's more shocking?
Yeah, I think so very much. And in many ways, it's about the balance between appealing to audiences who are not necessarily, experts or fans, if you like, if you can call it that, of this particular genre, but also those people who are perhaps desensitized, who have watched again and again these kinds of programs. It's almost, how shocking can you go? Certainly from a broadcast point of view, and certainly from a film point of view, there are big questions around that about censorship and what is acceptable to be broadcast, although things are a lot more relaxed than, certainly in the last few years, than they have ever been, I think, really, in terms of giving the full gory details. And it's at what point is that adding to the story? To what extent is also that pandering to perhaps another rather unsettling side of audience interest in crime, which has always been the case. There's always been like that pocket of the audience that for all kinds of different reasons are interested and fascinated with the mechanics of this particular area.
And there's certainly perhaps a fascination with the macabre and that pulls people in, and that if
we wouldn't have a whole sort of horror movie industry.
Well, it's exciting. Well, people like to be frightened, don't they? And I think that's very much a part of these kinds of documentaries. I also think as well it's a mixture of, thank goodness that's not me, that I haven't got that. And I also think as well, and this is a little bit like the soap operas, in that people also almost rehearse how they would react in a similar kind of situation.
Like the zombie apocalypse plan. I'm pretty sure everyone has a zombie apocalypse plan.
Yes, the what if scenario. Yeah,
I don't have a zombie apocalypse plan.
You don't have a zombie apocalypse plan?
No, maybe that's.
What
maybe
are you going to do when
bad.
it happens?
Well, I could see the end of the world coming and imminent destruction, but I'm not sure that zombies will feature.
Maybe we already have our living zombies. People in the media.
Well, interestingly, there's a very interesting article that's written that touches on some of those themes about where reality and fiction and the boundaries touch in relation to crime and criminality, because it actually appeared in a criminology journal, which was by a criminologist, Dr. Tom Raymond, that talked about The Walking Dead, and he says actually one of the things that's really interesting about The Walking Dead is if you see it as a sort of zombie movie, you're missing the point. Really, The Walking Dead is much more about how humanity turns on one another and what its more base instincts are. Yeah. And if you think about it, the walkers are not really the threat. The threat is the other survivors and how inhuman we can be to other humans once the sort of system of control and our formal mechanisms are all lifted.
Well, all good films and documentaries should do that. It should open up questions and debate. And I often wonder about some of these more sensationalist crime programs, whether it's almost like just laying on a plate everything for the audience. We don't have to think about these things, whereas other documentaries that go a little bit further will allow the audience to question, will almost be presenting the evidence for the audience to make up their own mind in many ways.
Yeah, so again, perhaps an interesting way to judge the quality is to think about to what extent it's raising these issues as complex rather than
But you mentioned at the beginning the Zac Efron Ted Bundy film. I think that was one good thing about that. What's really good about that film is that was left to the point where you got to the end and you sat there and you're thinking, I'm not sure he did it. It was really
playing around with those ideas.
Yeah, it was really, really well done. And
although there's a complexity in that, because at the same time, ultimately, if you look at the case of Bundy, we can be utterly sure that he was a ruthless killer.
Yeah, of course he was.
We're not sure that he did it. Was very much sort of played out as a
means
of
through her mind.
Absolutely.
I think that's where it did really, really well. It was really well done, I think.
I suppose a legal issue is obviously with cases that have been resolved and the perpetrators have been put behind bars and so on. If the media then unpick that further, is that perhaps rejecting what the judge and the jury decided all those years ago or whenever?
I think with that one is, he did it. Like you said, he's a ruthless killer, but it was framed so well through the eyes of his then girlfriend that sort of you were going through with her sort of like, did he or didn't he? And that was fantastic.
Yeah, I think you're right. Actually, extremely wicked. I can't remember the rest of the slant on it, but it's extremely wicked, and some other descriptors that the judge made of Bundy is the title of the film. And essentially, I think you're right. I thought I went in to watch it expecting very little in some ways, thinking that it was going to be, because we've seen the sort of the serial killer given their sensationalism.
And to be fair, he was in High School Musical.
Well, that's an interesting point. If he hadn't been cast, would that have changed things? Because a lot of dramas, if you cast an unknown actor, that can often add greater value to understanding the issues. If you're seeing Zach there,
just about to break into song,
that you associate with an entertainment genre, that's putting bums on seats and so on. Does that detract from the accuracy of the piece if people are watching it? And a lot of performers, there's no doubt about it, we look at those people as stars, and there are ghosts of their previous incarnations, their previous performances. But the other side of it is, from the film and media point of view, is you have to have those people to attract and sell a film. You can't sell a film with an unknown.
Yeah, and I suppose for the actor involved in the sort of docu-dramatisation as well, they're the sort of complex roles that allow them to sort of express a fuller range of than simply ever being the good guy in The Greatest Showman, or which is the only way that I know.
I'm just thinking who have I managed to insult this week. So we've got Trump supporters, anyone that loved High School Musical, people who liked the War Weddings and a Funeral.
Did anyone love High School Musical? Did anyone love The Greatest Showman? I mean, I say that as a father of an 8-year-old, so I do know that there are people that love The Greatest Showman. But I mean, in years to come, young children will be shattered when they realise that Zac Efron went from being the assistant of PJ Barnum to Ted Bundy. They're just not quite old enough yet.
What's interesting is what levels of research he was involved in. I mean, the script, hopefully, a good script should be able to give the actor everything that they need. But where do they go for that inspiration? Whether that's talking directly to people, or it's often looking at archive footage. And if you're looking at archive footage, are you impersonating the person, or are you adding more depth and detail to something that we're not necessarily seeing?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because again, what happens as a result, and when we were talking about sort of reopening the wounds, it's really shown, I think, with Extremely Wicked and the extra bit of the strapline, because what quickly becomes apparent, for example, is while that's broadcast and I think Sky have the sort of rights on it, and Sky Box Office make it, release it at the cinema and on their boxes at the same time. Things like Netflix then re-release the Ted Bundy tapes, so they use the sort of original archive, which probably would have featured in Efron's watching to rehearse for the role.
Well, everybody wants to back a winner, and often there are these spin-offs that come out of a film such as that. It reawakens the interest. And so
when that case comes back in, and I suppose the negative side for that, for as we say, for victims, even those
victims,
perhaps,
is it?
Those
family
more
members
broadly
of the perpetrator. We often forget those people,
totally.
Especially like Ted Bundy had a child.
Totally, those.
You've got to grow up with that legacy. This is my dad.
Well, yeah, similarly, and I think in the broadest sense, if you think about the number of people who are, for example, law enforcement officers investigating investigating those cases, those sensational cases, are likely to be, the ones that get the taglines of crossbow cannibal or Camden Ripper.
Yes.
Those are perhaps for an investigating police officer are going to be the most horrific thing that they encounter in 30 years of quite a traumatic.
I must just say,
career.
in terms of the cannibal crossbow killer, I actually share the same name as the crossbow cannibal killer. Which is such a bizarre thing. And I was upset by the depictions in the media of what was going on because it was my name. I mean, how bizarre is that?
Well, no, I think again understandable, but I bet you Google hits, for example, for you as an academic would have gone through the roof at the time.
Because he was labelled as the academic killer, wasn't he?
He was, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I remember the opening of Newsnight that night was What Went Wrong with Stephen Griffiths, and that was the most bizarrest thing ever to have the same name. But what was interesting about it is that, unlike years ago with criminal cases, that case has pretty much been forgotten largely. I thought, am I going to be like associated with the like the Yorkshire Ripper or something like that? Every time I introduce myself, were people instantly going to think of this guy who murdered prostitutes in Bradford, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
So it is bizarre that.
Yeah, no, and I oddly enough, even as a criminologist, I hadn't made the association
because it was years ago, and I was quite grateful for that. But had it been in a sort of time when there were fewer media channels, if I'd have said my name, people would have been, but it's because it's replaced constantly.
And I suppose in some ways that's where that's also where sensationalism may do a favour, because the very sort of terminology of crossbow cannibal replaces the name, and it becomes the sort of moniker and description, which is the sort of sensationalism that in some ways we would sort of as criminologists be slightly adverse to. It's very very interesting.
Yeah, bizarre. It's a bizarre link to this. Yeah,
we just say we have all the best bizarre links.
If you go through Twitter, you will find a lot of people that share names with serial killers, and
absolutely. It's probably a
they
research
get some
project
terrible
itself.
times.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, people could.
Well, actually, one of my favourite stories on that one, and again, it's the link between sort of history and reality. It was I remember the conviction of Ian Wilkins, I believe, who was the lead singer of the Lost Prophets. Ian Watkins, sorry. And of course, there is another
Steps, isn't it?
Watkins, Ian
Watkins.
H. Watkins in Steps, who then got all of the hate directed at him for being the Lost Prophets lead singer. So that sort of mistaken identity aspect.
But also, I mean, in terms of the media as well, when we have no criminals that are there and there is an appeal for whoever, a description or a photo fit appears, anybody who looks like that person, all of a sudden there's a big question, and the media feed into that. Social media. I'm particularly thinking of the cases where there's been mistaken identity.
Well, I know that one well, because according to Google, I'm the author of fantasy novels, and I sometimes get accused of being a good cricketer for Kent as well, which I have no connection to. The other final and interesting one is I discovered that there's a chef called Cray Treadwell, also a Brummie. I mean, Cray as a first name. You'd think that there was a family connection, but no, none whatsoever. And certainly anyone who could be a chef can't have any
There's
connection
a celebrity
to me.
chef called Bavin.
Well, there you go. So there are these odd connections. But I suppose sort of finally on the theme of sort of responsibility, how we engage, going back to sort of those central questions. The one we perhaps haven't touched so much is simply why people want this content. We've said a little bit about why crime is appealing, but certainly sort of true crime seems to be the most appealing thing at the moment. Why do you think that is, Stephen?
I think it's very much about trying to explain the unexplainable. Why somebody would behave in this particular way, and as an audience, we want to know those details. Really, I think it's about that curiosity of knowing the reasons behind why somebody committed this crime, also how it's solved, also potentially how victims feel about what has happened, and so on. It's a whole kind of package, really, in many ways. I think it is very complex, I think, why people enjoy listening and watching those kinds of programmes and films.
But certainly there is a massive market for that. And this would be some of the stuff that would be covered if students came to Staffordshire to look at crime and film, as well as criminology and sociology.
I mean, it is big business, and let's not forget that we're talking here effectively about the entertainment industry. It is an industry at the end of the day.
And we've only talked about sort of documentary and drama really here, but as some of what we've said hints at, it extends into music, into mainstream media, into news media, into all television, areas, computer games, and popular culture. Yeah. Absolutely, the full extent. No, really, really fascinating, Stephen. So thank you ever so much for joining us. It's really appreciated. I'm hoping that listeners found it interesting, and if you did, do check out the website for Staffordshire University, where we have courses covering a whole array of different crime-related topics, and that includes our BA Honours, film, television, radio, our courses in criminology, sociology, policing and forensic science. Have a look at the website. I'm glad you've enjoyed listening to Crime Tapes today. Well, assuming that you have. I think it's fair to assume that they have. Kyla, they will have. You will have liked it. And finally, it's a goodbye from me, James Treadwell.
It's goodbye from me, Kyla, the resident Marxist.
And goodbye from me, Stephen Griffiths. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
The crossbow killer.
Thank you, Stephen. Not the crossbow killer.
No, the other one.
Not the crossbow killer, the other one.
It's the time of year where we all swap our deerstalkers for our festive hats. So we'd like to take the opportunity to wish all of our loyal listeners happy holidays.
And we hope you have the best start to 2020.